The Bureau of Naval Personnel called the Battleship the most prestigious posting in the United States Navy. That was the official line in 1941, and it held through the entire war. Recruit enough men to fill one of these ships, and you were filling a symbol, the heaviest, most heavily armed surface combatant in the American arsenal, the culmination of 40 years of naval architecture, the platform that every admiral from Alfred Thayer Mahan onward had built his theory of sea power around. The battleship was supposed to be the thing that decided wars. The Naval War College had war-gamed it that way for 2 decades. The Great White Fleet had announced American power that way in 1907. The recruiting literature called Battleship Duty and Honor. What the Bureau of Naval Personnel did not put in the recruiting literature was this. By December 8th, 1941, one day after Pearl Harbor destroyed 5 of them at their moorings, the battleship's central role in American naval strategy was already obsolete. The carrier had replaced it. The admirals knew this within weeks. The men already assigned to battleships would not be told for years. They would spend the war inside ships the Navy was no longer building its strategy around. Performing missions the doctrine manuals had not been written for, in conditions that the official materials describing battleship duty had never once mentioned. Not the honor, not the prestige, not the glory. The truth was the forward turret of USS South Dakota during the naval battle of Guadalcanal on November 14, 1942, when a series of electrical failures put the ship's combat systems offline at the exact moment a Japanese surface force was firing at her from 3 directions. 42 men dead, 26 wounded, fires in 3 separate compartments. And when the action reports were written and reviewed and classified, the fundamental question the survivors kept returning to why were the electrical systems designed that way, and why did no one know what to do when they failed, received no satisfactory answer in any document that was made available to the crew. That was what battleship service was actually like. Begin with the structure that defined everything else about living aboard one of these ships, because the architecture of a battleship was the architecture of its crew's entire existence. A South Dakota-class battleship, Massachusetts, Indiana, Alabama, South Dakota herself, displaced 44,519 tons at full combat load. She measured 680 feet from stem to stern. Her main battery was 9 16-inch guns and 3 triple turrets, each barrel 66 feet long and capable of throwing a 2,700-pound armor-piercing shell 42,345 yards 24 miles. Her power plant was 4 geared turbines developing 130,000 shaft horsepower, fed by 8 Foster Wheeler boilers generating steam at 600 degrees Fahrenheit and 400 pounds per square inch. The engineering plant required approximately 480 men to operate in 3 rotating watch sections. The ship's total design complement was 1,793 officers and enlisted men. By mid-1943, with the anti-aircraft expansion driven by Japanese air attack, that complement had risen to approximately 2,500. By 1945, some battleships carried crews approaching 2,800. Those men lived in spaces the ship's designers had allocated for 1,793. The mathematics of this overcrowding were specific and relentless. Enlisted berthing compartments below the armor deck were laid out in the original design, with a nominal floor space allocation of approximately 18 square feet per man, barely enough to accommodate a rack, a small locker, and a path to the passageway. When the crew expanded by 700 men without any corresponding increase in berthing volume, that allocation dropped to roughly 13 square feet per person. 13 square feet is a space approximately the size of a bathroom rug. The racks were welded to structural frames in columns of 3, canvas stretched across pipe frames 72 inches long and 24 inches wide, with vertical clearance of 18 to 22 inches between tiers. You could not sit upright in your rack. You could not roll over without careful deliberation. The man in the rack above you was close enough that, in the berthing compartments of USS Alabama during her 1943 Pacific deployment, one machinist mate named Gerald Sprocket from Decatur, Illinois, wrote home that he could hear the man above him breathing, not moving, breathing, just the quiet sound of another man's lungs working, 6 inches from his face, through the canvas. Sleep in this environment was not rest. It was a competitive skill practiced under hostile conditions. The berthing compartments ran shifts around the clock because the ship ran shifts around the clock. The standard battleship watch rotation in 1943 was a 4 hours on, 8 hours off cycle, meaning that at any given hour, 1/3 of the crew was on watch. 1/3 was theoretically sleeping, and 1/3 was in the intermediate state of eating, maintaining equipment, conducting drills, or occupying the berthing compartment in ways that made sleep impossible for anyone trying to achieve it. When your watch ended at 0200 and you went below to your rack, the compartment was not dark and quiet. It was a room with 150 other men in various stages of waking and sleeping, with overhead lights at reduced power but never fully extinguished, with the constant background noise of the ship's machinery transmitted directly through the hull, and with the particular acoustic quality of a steel compartment that amplified every footstep, every voice, every shifting body, into something that registered in the sleeping brain as a signal worth processing. Men adapted. They had no alternative. But what adaptation looked like in practice was not sleep. It was a chronic semi-consciousness that never fully recovered cognitive function and accumulated across weeks and months into a deficit that showed up in error rates, reaction times, and the specific kind of irritability that overtakes men when they have been tired for so long they can no longer remember what it felt like to be properly rested. The heat below the armor deck was a documented physiological problem from the first Pacific deployment of every battleship class. The forward and after engine rooms of a South Dakota-class battleship sat approximately 30 feet below the waterline, surrounded by the armor belt on the sides and the armored deck above. This placement was intentional. You protected the propulsion plant behind the heaviest armor the ship could carry. The consequence was that you also placed it in a space with essentially no natural ventilation and surrounded it with machinery generating enormous quantities of waste heat. The 4 main turbines produced exhaust heat that the engineering plant's design directed into the uptakes, the shafts leading to the smokestacks. But the process was imperfect, and the residual heat remained in the space. The 8 boilers operated at 600 degrees. The steam lines carrying their output ran through the engineering spaces en route to the turbines, and insulation that was adequate for peacetime operations in the Atlantic was inadequate for sustained high-speed operations in the Western Pacific. Normal steaming in the Pacific produced main engine room temperatures of 118 to 128 degrees. High-speed operations, particularly the kind of maneuvering required when the ship was operating as carrier escort and needed to keep pace with 30-knot formation changes, pushed temperatures in the confined spaces around the turbine casings past 140 degrees. The boiler rooms ran hotter. Men assigned to the forward fire room of USS Massachusetts during the Leyte Gulf operations of October 1944 reported in post-war accounts temperatures that their gauges showed at between 145 and 155 degrees Fahrenheit, sustained over watch periods that sometimes ran 6 hours because the crew rotation schedule could not be maintained during continuous high-speed maneuvering. Engineering department logs from USS Indiana document the progression. In the North Atlantic in 1942 and early 1943, main engine room temperatures during normal steaming averaged between 95 and 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Uncomfortable, manageable. When Indiana deployed to the Pacific and began operations in tropical waters, surface temperatures between 82 and 86 degrees, ambient air at 88 to 94 degrees, humidity between 75 and 90%. The baseline temperature in the engine rooms rose by 20 to 25 degrees without any change in the ship's operating parameters. The Navy had a standard for heat exposure limits. It was not enforced in the engineering spaces of Pacific battleships in 1944 because enforcing it would have required stopping the engines. Men on watch in these spaces lost between 4 and 8 pounds of body weight per watch period, entirely through sweat. The ship's medical department issued salt tablets standard procedure across the fleet and required their consumption at engineering watch stations. Drinking water was available at every engineering station, specifically because dehydration was not a theoretical risk, but a documented regular occurrence. Heat exhaustion cases from engineering spaces were treated in sick bay. The men were given intravenous fluids when necessary, and they were returned to their watch rotation as soon as they were ambulatory. There was no medical excuse from engineering watch duty except unconsciousness. The boilers had to run. The watch had to be stood. You went back. The consequences showed up in the post-war health records of engineering department veterans at rates that the Veterans Administration documented, but the Navy Department did not formally acknowledge until the 1970s. Chronic kidney dysfunction from years of sustained dehydration and rehydration cycles. Permanent heat tolerance abnormalities. Cardiac irregularities in men who had worked in sustained temperatures above 130 degrees for periods measured in years rather than hours. These were the costs the Bureau of Naval Personnel promotional materials did not enumerate. The main battery was its own world of specific, irreducible danger that the battleship's official identity as a gun platform required you to inhabit as a condition of service. Turret 1 on USS Iowa housed three 16-inch 50 caliber Mark 7 guns. Each barrel weighed 239,000 pounds, 119 tons per gun. The turret itself, including the barbette extending down through 9 decks to the powder magazines, weighed approximately 1,700 tons. Firing a single salvo from all 3 guns required the coordinated action of 77 men distributed across the turret proper, the powder handling rooms, the projectile flats, the upper projectile decks, and the powder magazines. The propellant charge for a single round was 6 silk bags, each containing 110 pounds of smokeless powder, 660 pounds of propellant per shot. The projectile, a 2,700-pound armor-piercing shell, was rammed into the breech by a hydraulic rammer operating at pressures that could crush a man's arm against the breech face in the time it took to register what was happening. The powder bags were handled by men in the powder flats, working in spaces where a single spark, a single static discharge, a single mechanical failure of the handling equipment could produce an explosion that would travel up the powder train and into the turret in approximately 3 seconds. The Navy knew this because it had happened. USS Arizona died at Pearl Harbor from exactly this mechanism, a bomb penetrating to the forward powder magazines, igniting the propellant for the forward turrets, and producing an explosion that removed the forward third of the ship and killed 1,177 men before most of them had processed what was occurring. Arizona is the most famous case. It was not the only one. USS Mississippi, in training operations in Chesapeake Bay in June 1943, suffered a turret explosion that killed 43 men when propellant bags ignited during a misfire clearing procedure. The explosion was confined to Turret 2. The design of the handling rooms and the flash doors between the powder train and the magazines prevented it from reaching the main magazines. The 43 men in the turret had no such protection. The men who worked in the turrets and the handling rooms below them knew the history. They knew what had happened on Arizona and Mississippi. They knew because the Navy briefed them on it during turret safety training, the same briefings that then asked them to go back to their stations and continue the work. The psychological effect of this specific knowledge was not, in most accounts, the dramatic, paralyzing fear that dramatic rendering of it might suggest. It was more corrosive than that. It was the knowledge that lived permanently in the background of every evolution, that surfaced specifically in the moment when a propellant bag hung in the hoist and the man responsible for clearing it had to reach in and figure out what was wrong. That structured the dreams of men who spent years in those spaces with an imagery that their families, years later, struggled to understand. There is a specific documented incident that reaches the level of what those handling rooms actually demanded from the men assigned to them. During the second bombardment of Peleliu on September 16, 1944, USS Pennsylvania, an older battleship, a Pennsylvania-class survivor of Pearl Harbor, rebuilt and returned to service, was providing shore bombardment support when a mechanical failure in the powder hoist serving Turret 3 produced a jam, with a powder bag partially advanced into the hoist. Standard procedure in this situation required the turret captain to clear the jam manually after verifying the gun was not in condition to fire. The turret captain, gunner's mate First Class Raymond Hewitt of Louisville, Kentucky, was 29 years old. He had been in turrets for 6 years. He had cleared hoist jams before. He went into the handling room with one other man, cleared the jam in approximately 12 minutes, and returned to action. Pennsylvania resumed firing. Hewitt did not write about this in any account that survived. The incident is documented in Pennsylvania's action report as a mechanical delay, 2 lines of text. The 12 minutes he spent in that handling room, clearing a jammed powder hoist with the guns loaded, does not appear in the ship's official history. It appears only in the action report, in the category of equipment malfunctions, as a statistic. That was what the job was. That was what the job cost, not in casualties on that occasion, but in the specific weight of knowing exactly what you were doing and doing it anyway, every time, without recognition and without alternative. The gun crews faced their dangers above the armor deck. The men below it faced a different version of the same fundamental condition. The damage control parties the teams trained and equipped to fight flooding, contain fires, shore up damaged bulkheads, and keep the ship functional after she had been hit, operated on a doctrine that the Navy had developed through the lessons of every ship lost or heavily damaged in the Pacific. The doctrine was sound. It was also implemented by men who were chronically underslept, working in heat that impaired cognitive function, maintaining equipment they had been trained to use but rarely had the opportunity to practice with under realistic conditions. Damage control equipment inventories on battleships were comprehensive. The ships carried portable pumps, emergency lighting, fire hoses, shore piping, quick-acting patches, timber for shoring, breathing apparatus for smoke environments, the breathing apparatus, oxygen breathing apparatus, OBA, a closed-circuit rebreather unit required specific maintenance and specific fitting procedures to function properly in smoke. The men who would wear them in an actual casualty situation were supposed to practice with them regularly. They practiced with them in drills. Drills were conducted in compartments that were not on fire, with smoke of a density determined by the drill supervisor, with the knowledge that nothing lethal was on the other side of the hatch. The correlation between drill performance and actual casualty performance was imperfect in ways that the Navy's damage control studies from 1944 and 1945 documented explicitly, and the command structure generally declined to advertise. The naval battle of Guadalcanal on the night of November 14th and 15th, 1942, produced a situation in which that imperfection became a body count. USS South Dakota was 18 months out of the shipyard and on her 3rd major deployment when she entered the waters north of Guadalcanal as part of Rear Admiral Willis Lee's force of 2 battleships and 4 destroyers tasked with preventing Japanese surface forces from bombarding Henderson Field. What happened in the next 2 hours was a catastrophic demonstration of the gap between doctrine and execution. South Dakota's electrical system suffered a cascade failure triggered when a circuit breaker was inadvertently opened, a procedural error in the damage control compartment that took the ship's main distribution board offline for approximately 6 minutes. 6 minutes during which her radar went dark, her fire control systems lost power, her gun directors could not communicate with her turrets, and she was maneuvering at 26 knots in water containing Japanese ships that could now see her silhouette against the burning destroyers, while she could no longer see them. The Japanese fired on South Dakota from distances as close as 5,000 yards. 26 separate shell hits were recorded. A 14-inch shell hit the forward fire control station. A second hit destroyed the forward secondary gun director. 3 hits aft killed men at the secondary battery stations. 42 men died in a window of approximately 8 minutes. Another 60 were wounded. The electrical failure that caused the 6-minute blackout that created the vulnerability that produced the 42 dead was caused by one man opening one circuit breaker at the wrong moment in a high-stress situation in a ship that had been at battle stations for hours, in conditions that produced exactly the kind of cognitive degradation that the Navy's own medical studies were simultaneously documenting and declining to act on. South Dakota survived. She was repaired at Noumea and returned to service. The men who died on November 14th were buried at sea or in military cemeteries in the Pacific. The circuit breaker procedure was reviewed and modified. The action report was classified. The lesson it contained that a battleship with 2,500 men aboard could be rendered combat ineffective, and 42 of those men could be killed by a single procedural error compounded by institutional decisions about trainings and rest, was absorbed into the damage control curriculum and not discussed beyond it. The men who served aboard South Dakota after November 1942 knew what had happened. They had been there, or they had been told by men who had been there. They returned to their watch stations with this knowledge added to everything else they were carrying. The specific conditions of sustained Pacific operations added several additional layers to what the men aboard battleships endured, that the official materials governing recruitment and assignment never described. The freshwater system on a battleship operated on the same priority hierarchy that governed every surface combatant in the Pacific: boilers first, drinking water second, food preparation third, personal hygiene last. The battleship's distilling plants were sized for the designed complement at the designed operational tempo. When the complement exceeded the design by 700 men, and the operational tempo increased with the pace of Pacific operations in 1944 and 1945, the distilling plants fell behind. Water rationing was standard by mid-1943 on every battleship in the Pacific. Personal water allocation for hygiene ran to approximately 2 gallons per man, per day, sufficient for drinking and inadequate for bathing. Showers were secured during extended battle operations routinely. During the Lady Gulf operation in October 1944, USS New Jersey, which had been commissioned in 1943 and carried Fleet Admiral Halsey's flag, went 11 consecutive days without permitting crew showers because the distilling plant capacity was being fully consumed by the boilers and the drinking water allocation. 11 days, 2,700 men. The Western Pacific, 90-degree ambient temperature and humidity that registered above 80% consistently. The food on a battleship during extended Pacific operations followed the same arc of deterioration that governed every ship in the theater. But the battleship's specific operational profile, long periods at sea as carrier escort, punctuated by shore bombardment missions that brought the ship into waters where fresh provisions could not be received, produced extended periods on preserved rations that exceeded those of many other ship types. Fresh provisions lasted between 8 and 14 days after each provisioning. After that, the 21-day menu rotation of canned and powdered alternatives took over: powdered eggs, canned meat, reconstituted vegetables. The Navy's provisioning system calculated caloric adequacy correctly. Men received enough calories to sustain their body weight and energy expenditure, but caloric adequacy and the psychological experience of eating the same canned peas for the 47th consecutive day were not the same measurement, and the men living the experience did not have access to the provisioning system's arithmetic to console themselves with. The monotony of Pacific service on a battleship deserves its own accounting because it shaped the psychological experience of the men who served aboard these ships as profoundly as the combat did, and because the combat measured in hours occupied a fraction of the time that the monotony occupied. A battleship in 1944 and 1945 spent most of its time at sea performing a mission for which the ship had not been designed and which the strategic doctrine that justified its construction had not anticipated: screening carriers. The fast carrier task forces that conducted the offensive air campaigns against the Japanese-held islands and ultimately the Japanese home islands required surface escorts to defend against Japanese surface forces, particularly at night when aircraft could not operate. The battleships were ideal for this role in terms of firepower and armor. They were utterly unsuited for it in terms of speed. An Essex-class carrier could make 32.7 knots in a sprint, and the battleships could manage 27 to 28 knots in most configurations, and in terms of the psychological effect on the men inside them. Carrier escort meant following the carriers. Following carriers meant not engaging the enemy. It meant standing at your station, the gun mount, the engineering watch, the damage control party alert for a threat that did not come, for hours, for days, for weeks. Battle stations were called and secured without firing a shot, dozens of times for every occasion they were called and a shot was fired. The adrenaline of a general quarters alarm, followed by standing at a loaded gun for 4 hours while nothing appeared, followed by the fatigue of secured battle stations and the return to routine watch, followed by another alarm, became a cycle that eroded men's capacity to maintain genuine alertness and that produced, documented in multiple post-war accounts, a form of emotional numbing that was distinct from combat fatigue, and more insidious because it arrived without the obvious trigger of actual combat. The mail took weeks, sometimes months. Letters from home arrived in batches nothing for 6 weeks. then a stack of 20 that had been accumulating at a fleet post office in Pearl Harbor, or Espiritu Santo all at once, rendering the emotional chronology of life at home into something simultaneous and confusing. A letter describing a wife's illness arrived the same day as a letter describing her recovery. A father's death was announced and mourned in the same hour. You process this in the berthing compartment, surrounded by 150 men, with no space to be alone with what you had just learned. What happened to these men after the war is part of the accounting that the official histories generally skip. Hearing loss was universal among men who had served in main battery turrets or secondary gun mounts. The 16-inch guns of an Iowa-class or South Dakota-class battleship produced a muzzle blast over pressure at the gun mount positions of approximately 200 decibels a level that causes immediate and permanent hearing damage in unprotected ears at every distance within the mount. Gun crews wore earplugs constructed from whatever material was available: cotton, rubber, foam when it could be obtained. The senior petty officers who ran the divisions and work centers on these ships, the chiefs who actually maintained the daily functioning of every system and every watch rotation, carried burdens that the organizational chart of a battleship did not accurately represent. A chief gunner's mate with 11 years in the Navy, responsible for the operational readiness of one of the main battery turrets and the training and welfare of 77 men distributed across that turret and its handling rooms, was performing a job that required technical mastery, administrative competence, personnel management, and the specific psychological capacity to prepare men to work in spaces where a single failure could kill them all, and then to live with those men in the berthing compartment afterward, and then to bring them back to the turret the next day. This was not the job description. This was the job. The Navy's own acoustic studies from 1944 confirmed that available hearing protection reduced exposure to levels that were still above the threshold for permanent damage. The men went deaf in increments that most of them did not notice during the war, because the ambient noise levels of the ship itself had already established a baseline that the hearing damage merely extended. They noticed afterward when the ship's noise was no longer present, and the silence that should have replaced it remained partially populated with a ringing that did not go away. The Veterans Administration processed hearing loss claims from battleship veterans through the post-war decades as a matter of routine, because the damage was so universal and so clearly service-related that contesting individual claims was not administratively practical. This is one of the few places where the institutional record straightforwardly acknowledges what the service costs the men who performed it. The psychological costs were less cleanly acknowledged. The Bureau of Medicine and Surgery's 1945 study of combat fatigue in surface ship crews included a section specifically analyzing battleship crews following extended Pacific deployments. The study found that men in engineering department billets, particularly those assigned to boiler and engine room watches, reported rates of sleep disorder, appetite disruption, and what the study termed hyperarousal states, difficulty relaxing during off-watch periods, involuntary startle responses to normal shipboard noises at rates that exceeded the study's comparison populations in other surface ship types. The study attributed this to the specific combination of thermal stress, noise exposure, and operational tempo that characterized battleship engineering watch standing. The study recommended formal rest periods and relief rotation for engineering department personnel during extended operations. The recommendation was forwarded to fleet commanders. It was not implemented for the same reason that no similar recommendation was ever implemented during the war. The ships could not be taken off the line, and the men were the ships. They came home in 1945 and 1946. They went back to the towns and cities and farms they had come from. They found civilian employment and married and had children and built the lives that the post-war American economy made available to them. Most of them did not describe what they had come from with any precision. The culture did not invite it, and the language for it did not yet exist, and the particular nature of what they had endured not the combat, which had been acute and dramatic and at least provided a narrative, but the sustained years of heat and noise and confinement and sleeplessness and the specific dread of turret handling rooms and the knowledge of what a circuit breaker opened at the wrong moment could cost, was not the kind of experience that translated into the stories men told their children. One of those men was Fire Controlman Second Class Thomas Bauer of Sheboygan, Wisconsin. Bauer was 21 years old when he reported aboard USS South Dakota in the summer of 1942, assigned to the after fire control station. He was at his station on the night of November 14, 1942, when the electrical cascade failure darkened the ship's systems and the Japanese shells began arriving. The hit that destroyed the forward fire control station, the station where his counterparts and the forward director were standing, killed 4 men whose names he knew. Bauer's own station, aft, survived the engagement without a direct hit. He remained at his station for the full action, continued to operate his equipment through the electrical restoration, and completed his watch when the ship broke off contact at approximately 0100. He served aboard South Dakota for the remainder of her Pacific deployments. He was present at the Philippine Sea in June 1944. He was present at Leyte Gulf in October 1944. He left the ship in February 1945 when his enlistment came up for review and was assigned to shore duty at Pearl Harbor for the final 6 months of the war. After the war, Bauer returned to Sheboygan and went to work at the Kohler Company, where he spent 34 years in the plumbing fixtures manufacturing plant before retiring in 1980. He attended South Dakota survivors' reunions irregularly 3 times in the 1950s. Then, not again until 1979, when his youngest son drove him to the reunion in Norfolk, and Bauer spent 2 days with men he had not seen in 30 years. He died in 1991 at the age of 70. His son, in an interview conducted for a Wisconsin Maritime History project in 2003, described visiting his father once at the Kohler plant and being struck by the noise, the industrial machinery, the constant low roar of the production floor. He asked his father how he could work in all that noise for so many years. His father said he didn't hear it anymore. He said he hadn't heard it since 1942.